Good morning, everybody. We'll wait a couple minutes because there were some glitches getting people in. So we'll give you a couple more minutes to make sure everybody gets on. We'll be starting about 5 minutes late. Sorry. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's 12:05, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. I would gladly introduce to you Dr. Rosylnn Mannon, who's a professor in the College of Medicine, Pathology, and Microbiology at UNMC. She's Vice Chair for Research and Associate Chair of Research in Nephrology. Dr. Mannon is a fellow in the American Society of Nephrology and the American Society of Transplantation. A Duke-trained nephrologist, Dr. Mannon is a past president of the American Society of Transplantation and is a deputy editor of the American Journal of Transplantation. Dr. Mannon's laboratory research focuses on mechanisms of chronic graft injury using in vitro and in vitro models of drug toxicity in kidney transplantation. She's published over 200 peer-reviewed publications on chronic allograft failure and post-transplant complications and therapies. She serves on several leadership positions in transplantation across the country. At any rate, greatly welcome Dr. Mannon, who's going to talk to you today. She's been at UNMC, 2.5 years, I believe, Roz, getting started with your research, identifying resources, and developing strategies. Welcome, Dr. Mannon.
Well, thanks, Chi-Chi. Actually, I hit my 3-year anniversary last week or the week before. So I actually arrived right before COVID, which I don't recommend to anyone restarting, moving. But what I tried to do is kind of cover a number of topics that for some of you who are not related to UNMC, I apologize. I tried to make this as broad as possible. And again, if you have questions, it's hard for me to see the chat feature. So there is a Q&A panel, maybe put them in there. I might just decide to just answer them at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, my goals today really are a couple of objectives. One, to give you some very basic information about starting research projects. And this is just the way I think about it. This is the way I mentor people. This is, whether you're an extensively trained trainee or someone who has been doing things for a while, you may say, well, this is really too simple for me, but hopefully you'll find something worthwhile here. And then I will probably highlight mostly things from UNMC in terms of potential research resources. And you'll see that my angle will tend to be human research, but much of what I tell you, the technical aspects may be different, but the theme of how you execute research is the same for basic science, and I have basic science expertise. And regardless of the type of research you do, you're the primary investigator, the principal investigator, and so you're ultimately responsible for the execution of your research subjects can be humans or they can be animals, and others that are participating in your research project are under your advisement and are your responsibility. And so proper execution of your study is really on you and not necessarily your study coordinators or other investigators. I think first and foremost, the hardest thing for people is to develop a research idea. And that's really where I always start off is, what is your idea? And maybe you really need to think about what your subject area or interest is. And when you think you sort of understand that what your area is, the question always to me is what is your hypothesis? I think a lot of times when we're first starting out, we really think about associations and we don't think like, what am I really asking? And I think that's really important. And as you're doing that, you really need to look at what's been done. And to decide on a research focus, you probably need to do a literature review on the topic. I always try to come up with some general references. I try to ensure then eventually as I progress that I have a more complete understanding of what's in the knowledge and identify within that literature. Sometimes I'm upset, I'll Google it or I'll use Google Scholars, I'll show you. I find there's elements already been done. I think it's important to then think about what are the gaps in the literature, what are the unmet needs, are prior data of poor quality. And if there's not a knowledge gap, maybe then and you can't think of one, then maybe it's not an area that you want to get into. For example, COVID research. If you're going to go into COVID research, there's a broad literature and you need to narrow it down and say, well, what do people really need to know about COVID right now? And that's just sort of a general example. You know, you really have to search the literature. And I show some screenshots of things that I use like PubMed and Google Scholar. We have access here to Scopus and Web of Science. Some institutions use this RefSeek. But I also think it's not a bad idea to reach out to your librarian. And we have, for the most part at UNMC, but the other institutions as well, can provide searches free of charge, whether you give them keywords or they can assist in scoping reviews. Those scoping reviews are probably not free. This is the McGugin webpage here, and there's a whole thing about search requests as well as a systematic review of the literature. So if you think you've got a brilliant idea, sometimes it's great to have a third party do a search for you and identify, is this really an area that is unmet or how can I fit that in? I really think it's important to know that the thing isn't being done already. And sometimes when we have research projects, it's not ready for prime time. And so there may not be any publications, or you're relying on my institutional memory, which is quite vast in transplant, but probably wouldn't help you in cardiovascular disease. So I also do this myself personally. I go into NIH Reporter. This is a free access website where you can go in and put in the name of an investigator or a type of project and see if anything comes up. But and there are other reporting accesses, like Grant Forward requires institutional membership. We don't have it at UNMC, but everyone has access to Reporter. But something that Chi-Chi taught me about was this Reporter and Matchmaker shown down here. And if you actually go into Reporter Matchmaker and paste your abstract or sort of a global summary of what you're trying to do and hit search, it will show you similar projects that are currently funded that match important keywords. So that's important to know. It's important to not be writing grant projects and publications if someone is already covering that topic. And the responsibility in NIH Reporter here is that when you put a PI back in here, you will get their current grant funding. And each subject title is characterized by ongoing publications that you may not be aware of, other projects or other patents that they may have, so that you at least you've done your due diligence and you have a global understanding of whatever you're investigating is. I think it's important to talk with people. I think that in this environment, it has been difficult to do that. Hopefully you all have a mentor. When I am trying to float a project, I don't just show up and say, I have this brainstorming idea of X. I have either an idea page, not necessarily an elevator speech, but I have almost a specific aims page, but probably not to that detail, where I have like a paragraph of background. Why is this important? I have my hypotheses and how I think I'm going to try to study the question. Maybe another strategy is to make a figure of what you want to do. Oftentimes I have figures in my specific aims page, but sometimes, putting it out there really helps you sort of say, well, what am I really trying to do? Another way of getting information is attending meetings and listening to topics of interest that may or may not be directly related, maybe tangential, and also spending time to go to the posters. You know, when you listen to an oral abstract at a national meeting, I find it personally intimidating. I often don't know, am I smart enough? And I hate going to the microphone, and you know, and that's not great, because you should be asking and you should feel empowered. And so sometimes less intimidating are the poster sessions, where you can go up and spend more time, less than, you know, now we're doing 7-minute abstracts, 5 minutes. It's hard to get all that information quickly. But I would encourage you to look at a meeting before you go, look at the poster sessions, put in the keywords and the web-based tools for these meetings, go to those posters, introduce yourself and say, hey, so-and-so from UNMC, you know, I have some questions about your poster. You don't have to let on necessarily that that's your focused area, but it gives you an opportunity to see what other people are doing. I think looking at the methodologies are also important to see how competitive you are. One way here that you can look for internal expertise is through Research Nebraska. And I show this webpage. This is actually me, so you don't, you know, I'm not showing somebody that I'm worried to expose them, but it gives you not only an opportunity, I see it primarily as an opportunity for potential collaborators and or mentors. And I encourage people that I mentor to look, because I'm relatively new here. So I don't really know who's in the area that may have defined expertise. And these individuals, the computer thinks are really good people for me to talk to. And this is sort of an idea of who I've been collaborating with over the years. You can see a big section here where I have multiple publications from a large NIH-funded grant where I was one of the sites, but we were very productive, and other tangential things around. Sometimes this is just good to look at. You may not have those contacts, but you can look on each of the spokes and say, hey, and I think Jared Anzalone, you're down in here somewhere with N3C, for example. But again, the notion here is really finding people, getting information and gathering it. And when you're developing a program about a question, you know, you have to think about ahead of time the logical sequence of future studies. And so you want to think about how successful you might be. I know this is a lot of pre-planning, but again, you know, looking at collaborators, you know, are there areas of your expertise that are missing? And we'll go into that in more detail. Is the research that you're doing complementary to that of a collaborator, which may build a very strong relationship? And what is the population? You know, coming to Nebraska and wanting to study individuals from certain African communities that have migrated here as a collective may be a brilliant idea and a brilliant opportunity. You wouldn't do that in the Deep South, where much of the African-American population has lived there for many, many years. So I think that if you're going to do population-based studies and you're going to make vast claims about ethnicity and race, you need to think about the populations you're studying. Now, more importantly, you got to evaluate your situation. And this has been a tough week for me. And I'll say when I evaluated my situation, I wasn't feeling too happy about myself. But you got to take a self-assessment. You have to look at yourself. And if you have a mentor, where is your experience level? Are you starting here? Or are you up here to the intermediate or advanced? And then importantly, these are the things you need to have. You know, do you have institutional support? That may be money. It may require space. Do you have the right people to help you? Are there core resources you require? And the biggest and most important one is protective time. So you can have all the support in the world, but if you're only allocated 10% of your day to doing your research project and the rest of the time you're teaching or training or seeing patients, it's going to be pretty difficult to make yourself successful unless you're an insomniac. So this is an example of an old whiteboard I had before I moved, showing you a very crazy life that I had there. And my current life is almost as crazy. But again, you can't just step out of this didn't happen overnight. This took me many, many years of connections and collaborations and interactions and sort of figuring out what my priorities were and including people that I was mentoring and making sure I was following up with them. So again, you don't need to start out this way, but sometimes having a board and having your things up and what your timelines are is important. Again, when you're designing, say, a clinical research program, you really have to be clear about what your hypothesis is. And if you're doing a specific study, you know, what are your endpoints? And again, you can do science that's associative. It's harder to get it funded, and you may start off that way saying, I don't know why people are depressed when they're overweight. And then you can define that further, like, well, maybe they're overweight because they have type 2 diabetes. Just an example. It's important that you have a way of collecting your data. If it's animal data, you have to have a central place that you can store that data safely and securely. You may want to develop a database if you're doing clinical work. This is often really nice if you're using institutional data, because this can be your historical control. Participating in biobanks and repositories. So we have an advantage here. We do have a biobank of individual specimens that's available. So if you're looking for normal control people that don't have a lot of health issues, or you have a hypothesis about a specific disease state, and it's important to map things out. And what I find, and this also still happens to me, is I jump in, I'm super excited, and I'm doing all this, and then suddenly I go, well, what's next? And you have to stop and take time to think. What do you need to consider? Who's going to be your funding sources? What is the support staff that you will need? If you're doing clinical research, who's going to manage your regulatory paperwork? Who's going to manage your budgets? And if you're doing a clinical trial, an interventional trial, for example, not a registry study or a natural history study, how do you see yourself? Or do you see yourself doing the screening and enrollment yourself? Well, I certainly did that when I started out, but as I got more experienced, I was doing multiple studies and was really relying on other individuals to help. So this is sort of a model of what a clinical research enterprise could look at. This was one of my colleagues at UAB who's now retired and works for one of the big clinical research organizations, with the notion that you have your ideas and you're collecting data, and you have to really have a strong study protocol. And again, while this really applies to human beings, I think you could substitute some of this information. We still have intense regulation with animals, as you all know, and all these concepts are really important. Your study design is really critical, and your submission will be reviewed in terms of adequacy of study design by whether it's the IACUC or the IRB. And then you obviously have a budget. I'll talk a little bit about grants and contracts and sponsors a little bit later. So for me, this is a study design that I sort of have here, where I know about the UNMC cores. I have clinical research that I do and I also have lab investigation. So, people like me don't really exist anymore, because it's really hard to do this in the way the climate is currently. And so more and more, most of us sort of get boxed into one area of expertise or the other. And my lab does interact with the organ procurement organization here, Nebraska. And then I depend a lot on informatics. And here I use the example of N3C, but that's a multi-institutional collaboration. And I also have colleagues at my old institution as well. Again, this is just a model. It's flexible, but it has pretty significant overhead. And that's because the people are what oftentimes you need. And this is a screenshot of a picture of one of my more successful clinical trials teams. So this was my group under my direction, where I had a regulatory manager who also happened to manage the budgets, came from the cancer center. She was terrific. I had research coordinators. Not every coordinator was an RN. We had RNs. We had staff people inputting data. And then biostatistics and bioinformatics were separate. And we also had bench lab personnel because we were doing translational work and collecting samples. So the big overhead often is the people, not the facility. And it's important to get good people. And it may be hard in this climate, as I can attest, to finding those people that have the passion that you have, and also the success and the ability to support you. So I emphasize the notion of collecting baseline data and clinical disease. That could be retrospective analyses. It could be based on a quality improvement project, for example, testing the outcome variables. It's important to publish and get things published in quality journals. There's a plethora of open access journals now. I'm sure many of you get 2 or 3 emails a night. And the question is that going to really help you? And I would say that reviewers are aware of these open access journals that may just be primarily based to make money and publish your work. And so you need to be careful now, because so many journals are open access. And you want to get quality, impact factors, citation scores. When you're doing clinical work, I think it's appropriate to have pilot studies, and I'll show you there is pilot money here. And then maybe defining a higher quality study where there may be randomization, blinding, or stratification, so that you don't have investigator bias. So who's available to you? I mean, oftentimes I think you sort of feel free floating. And so I always say your mentor, you may have a division or department research manager available to you. You may or may not have a division grant coordinator. So for example, I don't have a grant coordinator within my division because my division is primarily a clinical educator. I depend a little bit on the department grant coordinator. And I also work with the dean's office grant coordinator for both pre-award submission and then post-award management. Your peers and other faculty are really important. And I'll emphasize this over and over again, that it's best to put your ideas out here at home where you feel comfortable and people know you, because the bullets can fly when you go out, nationally or you go internationally. People are not inhibited to help, they're going to tell you the truth and it may hurt. I'd rather hear the bad news from my family, right? Nobody wants to sort of put themselves out. There are vice chairs of research and associate vice chairs of research, and now we have the vice chancellor's office as well, although I never go up the chain of command until I've talked and sort of worked things out locally. I mentioned the CTR coursework, so there are courses that you can actually take in the graduate school. The scholars programs, both in the IDeA CTR and the medical scholars program by the VCR's office, have very specific coursework if you're trying to think about how to do a clinical project. And I would also encourage you to look at the Vice Chancellor of Research website. Here's just a screenshot. This is, so all the pages have been updated, and I tried to update all my screenshots, but again, it's, this is in the College of Medicine. It's just kind of a good place to start. And you could just keep going down the rabbit hole with each of these resources, but we often say, well, I don't know where to go. Well, there often are places that you can go. And while there may not be phone numbers for direct contact, many of these things, for example, the IACUC or the IRB, you can email and get an email response a little bit quicker than maybe Cox Communication or getting on a long phone call with Verizon because your access is bad, for example. So it's important to, in your self-assessment, to understand several skills. And these are important backbones to being a good scientist. Being an excellent scientist is your writing ability, your ability to present in front of people, your research-specific skills, and the scope of work you have planned. So for writing, there are several levels. Have you written an abstract? Have you submitted it? Has it gone on ever as an oral or as a poster? Have you written a paper? And have you written a grant? And I sort of start them from the lowest skill level to really the highest. Have you presented to other individuals? And so we'll talk about that in terms of whether you're local or regional or national. And, if you're doing bench work, do you have the right skills? Do you need to go to a workshop to develop those particular skills in more depth? Or, if you're doing more desktop, computer related research, do you have the right coding skills or do you have the right assessment tools? And then again, I emphasize the scope of work. Can you physically, mentally do this work? Is it possible that you really need a collaborator? Like maybe you can get the next gen sequencing done in the clinic, in the core here on all these patients, but who's going to help you analyze that data? Will that person be you? That's great. But if you don't have that, and you've not done it before, you've not published in it before, it's worth adding a collaborator, working with a collaborator to get additional help, training, and also expertise on a grant. I think abstracts are probably, like I said, the easiest. It's a brief presentation. Most places it's about 250 words. The format is based on a meeting. We have poster templates here internally. You don't have to use them. Sometimes they don't align with the template that the organization you're meeting with has. But again, you can print them here. You can print them at the company. Or if you're going to be doing an oral presentation, there are specific time limits you must adhere to. And I can't tell you as a moderator how many times people have gotten up and just are talking, and you have to pull them off and say, I'm sorry, there's no time for the Q&A. Don't give up. Don't say, I got to show all my data and I don't care if I miss the Q&A. The Q&A is really, really important. And an old mentor of mine said, don't let out a big sigh when you show your last slide, because now the real part of the presentation is coming. It's your ability to listen to a question and answer. If English is not your first language, I actually just came from a meeting in Asia where the meeting was in English, but everybody had phonetically written out their talk and they came to the podium with papers and went through each slide that way. And I think it's perfectly acceptable to do that. One person was reading it off their iPhone. It was a little hard because I was like, oh, is someone typing this? I think you use whatever tools you need to be effective. Maybe you need public speaking practice. I mean, I didn't learn how to speak in front of groups for a while. Be aware of the time limits for each of your slides. If your talk is 5 minutes, don't have 15 slides. You have to understand that the more complex a slide is, the more panels that you have, you need to express and understand. Don't assume that me sitting in the back of the room, sleep deprived, can read that and or interpret all the multiple panels. And I've seen this where people have one slide and they click, 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 and things keep appearing and they count that as one slide, but they probably spent 2 or 3 minutes explaining the slide. I recommend rehearsing, especially with these short time frames with PowerPoint. It's great. They actually will tell you how many times you say and blink too much. But importantly, it'll give you a sense that maybe the way you're presenting it is inadequate. I also recommend that the title of your slide indicates what you're trying to show. So if someone has a blackout or is texting somebody, which happens more and more these days, that they can understand what your concept is. And then again, there's a beginning, a middle, and an ending to your presentation. And it's important to acknowledge your funding sources in these presentations and the key collaborators. For manuscripts, I always, if I'm ready and I think I've got data, I really do consider target journals. Just today, someone sent me a paper that I should have written, but a junior colleague did it for me. Great. And he's like, well, what do you think our target journal was? Well, I would have thought about this first before I wrote the paper because every journal is a little different. And I would, if you're not certain, if you're uncertain, I would definitely talk with your mentor. And I would also say that if these are super novel findings, more and more people are using these preprint servers. And again, why do I bring this up at first is before you submit it to the preprint, be sure the target journal accepts that you have done a preprint worthy, because they get a preprint server because they get into these funny things about copyright. More and more now, the author guidelines have changed amongst all the major medical journals. And so what I'm finding is that if you don't format it properly and you submit it to whether it's editorial management, editorial manager, the Elsevier product or the Walter Kluwer's, they will kick you out. It won't even get to an assignment for a reviewer because the publication staff is either adhering by it or the computer is adhering by it. And be aware too that services now are doing two things. One, they're doing image review. So they're using highly qualified technical tools with computers to assess the quality of your figures and to suss out whether there's been any manipulation. And they're also using they're also using programs to see that there's not overlap with another paper or too much language that is overlapped, so that you may have a prior paper where your methods are copied and pasted. That's probably okay, but they're just making sure that there's not a plagiarism. This is plagiarism checks. Some do it at the beginning of the process, some do it at the end. I almost never get a paper in anymore. A couple I have, but usually I'm ready to, I usually am expecting reject and allow resubmission. It's hard when you get a reject, but I'm ready for it. And I think you have to have a plan. Like if it doesn't make this journal, where am I going next? And to try to address these criticisms without a lot of passion and negativity. And oftentimes when I get a reject, if it's a reject full, I have to put it away for a few days because I'm so angry. I can't passively, I can't get to that level that I can be unbiased. I'm just so stirred up and so angry that I have to just wait. So again, when you have a reject resubmission, be aware that some journals will give you a timeline. And if you need to do more experiments, which often happens, 90 days may be insufficient, especially if you're collecting human samples or doing animal studies. There's a basic guide for publications, again, on the UNMC library website, which is helpful. And there's actually some videos here that talk about these metrics, these scholarly metrics and what they mean, like H-index and the Scopus citation. There are manuscript writing workshops. I think CHRI has a really nice writing interest group. It is based on children and pediatrics, but it's pretty global. There actually is a course you can take for writing. There's supposed to be one in graduate studies, but I didn't put it in here. I couldn't find it. And there's now a new Department of Internal Medicine writing group as well. So keep your eyes and ears open in your own department. For this latter one, it's really to help you sort of coalesce your writing. It's going to include, and actually their first meeting is next week, but I'm happy to, if you reach out to me later, I can give you the information about who these are. But there are groups here that are peer reviewing work, mainly to sort of help you, guide you in terms of either the technique of your writing. It's probably not so much helpful in terms of the scientific content, like, is this good scientific content? Is this good statistical analysis? But really to help you focus on your writing skills and maybe, again, helping you with your grammar and recognition of some of the ways of some of the formulation of your wording. Grant submission is a totally other skill. And if you're going to be an investigator, you have to do it. It's something that I see people avoiding all the time. Really the courses, the CTR 901 and 903 really help individuals take that. And most of you aren't in the scholars program. And hopefully you've got a mentor that is successfully funded. And I would say there are many different opportunities, and I list some of them here. I'd also point out, and I'll show this to you, that the Center for Heart and Vascular Studies just revamped the center and their webpage. And I'll show you that in a minute, but also the NIH has specific institute workshops. The dean's office used to have a relationship with this company called Hanover. They don't do it anymore, but they actually have put, because it wasn't really helpful. And I'll say that I, as an experienced investigator, used them once and it was utterly useless. And I was like mad that I had spent the time preparing for this meeting and it was unhelpful. But some of these presentations are really good. They delve into specific types of grants and they're actually recorded and available up on our website. So the CHVR, just to give them a plug, they actually are going to have specific writing workshops. There was a boot camp run initially by Mary Lindsay that's being taken over. So please feel comfortable. Almost everything is related to the heart as far as I can tell. But you may have trouble finding that. Like if you're in oncology, like where does that fit in? So they're really trying to promote the utilization of these core resources with the notion of cardiovascular disease or vascular disease in general. But again, I always feel like any boat in the storm, and if all the boats are rising, maybe they would be willing to listen and take and help you. But again, the IDeA CTR has opportunities like this as well. This is just one disease-specific example. I think it's important to recognize that research data management is really a key part of funding. It's already mandated for the VA, but this is a new requirement, relatively speaking, in terms of, and we've had multiple webinars, don't forget it. And there are also specific requirements for genomic data. So remember that, when you're putting in, submissions, to pay attention to those announcements that we get internally, whether your institution does it through their grants and contracts or through the Vice Chancellor's office, that there are continued changes. For example, the NIH ceiling for PIs just went up as the max ceiling. And so that was something important to note, and it already took effect. There are some other, so funding sources. The next thing is money. And I just threw together a bunch of things that I know about because I'm on one of the review committees for some of these, but the College of Medicine has multiple grants, many of whom are focused specifically for really less experienced investigators, including this physician scientist training program, which is a program of excellence, the Mary and George White medical research. Again, you can look at the individual descriptions. I want to say the timelines just came out for some of these. I can never keep them straight because there's so many, thankfully. The VCR's office actually has, for the Mentor Scholars Program, a $25,000 mini grant, really to help you get core and key data. There are core facility vouchers where you may want to demonstrate that you can use a specific technique and you're going to do it in the core. So you might want to just make sure that you can actually get reliable sequencing data. It's just nice. It's nice to show that you're able to do it. And when you get a voucher, it's on your biosketch. It's in your resume. It's important. Here are other examples like the diversity grant. I know this call just came out, the Ittner Pediatric Grant, which is really focused on pediatric disease. And this Otis Glebe, which I thought is one I've never thought about applying for, but the notion of translating your findings into a community, as to more community-based practice and implementation. Again, what I would recommend is if you're going to look at this, read what the RFA is, read the request for the award, and see who the past funded projects were, maybe even reach out to one of those individuals and ask them. Here's the IDeA CTR, so everybody gets some love, but there are clearly pilot grants that are available. The nice thing here too is the opportunity to do a research studio. So unlike heart and vascular disease research, this research studio really is an opportunity to look at all the various aspects of health and disease that we study here at UNMC. And it involves all the IDeA states, so members that are involved in the CTR are important. And again, they need an Ames page and at least a research plan or more, and Chi-Chi may be able to say more about this, but more than just a few scratches on a piece of paper. But this is really you presenting your research idea and having an opportunity for people to talk to you beforehand so that they can outline what may be potential issues. Like if you're applying for a K, for example, looking at each element, like, is your career development plan adequate? How can we enhance these plans? Is the specific Ames page, could it be tendered better? Could your aims be more focused? And the outputs and application of what you're finding. Again, I'm showing this because the CHVR seems to have lots of money. So some of these are duplicative of things that I've already said, but I think it's worth looking at some of the specific things that they have available. This is all new. So I always say if it's new, take a look at least and spend a little bit of time. Obviously, the external sources are really what a lot of our academic success is built upon. And that includes the NIHK, which are mentored scientist awards, and then the independent investigator R awards. Many societies, disease-based societies, have targeted funding for developing investigators, whether it's the American Heart, nephrology, rheumatology, oncology. There may be foundations relative to your research. You know, March of Dimes is sort of interesting because you think it's just based on genetic diseases, perhaps, or in childhood development, but they often, when you read their RFA, it also includes other things like maybe that you wouldn't have thought of in terms of cell signaling that affects multiple tissues and genes. So again, it's important to know what the aims of this organization are and read the RFA carefully to make sure that your work fits the scope. Now, there are people that I know that are amazing that take something and then they can flip it and they can fit the scope. I've not been one of those people. And I think transplant is a very unique field that it's hard to just say, well, this is an interesting mechanism in alloimmunity. I'm going to just submit it to the rheumatology organization. The mechanisms of disease between autoimmunity and alloimmunity are different. So I'm aware of those changes. But again, knowing what the opportunities are important. And then, of course, there are industry-funded studies. Industry is happy to spend money on your research if it fits their needs. And so you have to be careful that you don't spend time like I did a couple of years ago, getting told, oh yeah, we're very interested in this research. And then I did all this work. And then they said, yeah, you know, our priority has gone elsewhere. And so they can do that. They can pivot and say, no, we really don't want to do that. So investigator-initiated studies through industry, they exist, but you want to be sure that your interaction with the company really makes sense. Some other research resources that I want to mention internally, particularly for clinical and translational research, there actually is a research handbook. Some of the chapters have been really updated very recently, but you need to know the lingo. If you're going to go into this, you need to know, and I will always mess up some of these names, particularly UniHealth and UniMed, but I'll just highlight them to you as well. So here, our grants and contracts is called SPA. Took me a while to remember Sponsored Projects Administration, but they are really the grants and contracts agency. So they look at pre-award and post-award submissions, and all of your things that are submitted have to go to them for their approval and sign off before they go to whatever federal agency that you're submitting it through. You do this through the submission, maybe through ADIS to get that approval. You know, you're writing the grant, you're submitting it up into Cayuse or you're using Assist. But ultimately, the submission approval has to go through when like if you're doing a subcontract for a study, it goes through ADIS and then that gets approved. Many of you that are in basic science departments have individuals to help you with this. So you may not know any of this information, so don't freak out. What I would freak out about is timeline. You have to be on this. You cannot, as you know, send this to SPA 2 days before the deadline. You have got to tell them ahead of time And I always give them 4 months. I always say, I'm going to put my RO1 in at this time in June, and they'll come back and say, I have to have everything by May 15th, for example. And that's timeline that you really have to work. So and if it's a multi-center, they may want to meet with you and have even more time. And note that you're not the only one submitting an RO1, that multiple people are using the same timeline. So I really try to be careful about the timing. UniHealth has really been facilitated to help clinical research that's industry funded. They help with confidentiality agreements. They help with EUAs and emergency use authorization. So we heard of this through FDA, but you may have, if you're a clinician, you may be looking at a specific drug that's never been done for a particular disease state, and the company is willing to let you release it to treat someone compassionately. And again, this is really housed in the CCTR, the vice chancellor. They're an important contracting arm, and it's really supposed to be sort of like a soup to nuts, one door place. You just come into the door and they help you. And they're really important for the contracting for these clinical enterprises that you have. UniMed, on the other hand, is really what I would call the innovation area, that if you're looking at technology transfer, such as patents, material transfer agreements, i.e., you're getting serum samples from another laboratory or animal tissue from another laboratory, not at UNMC, or CRADAs, which are specific defined research agreements with entities. This is the organization that you would go to. And this is the people that are going to have that big new building finally across right by Russell Skeeter's and ACE General. But again, they're very important. And I think the days of us calling a friend and saying, hey, can I get those tissues from you? I just want to test this antibody on them. And it might lead to something new, that you really should have an MTA in place, because I can't tell how many times you actually find something and then there's difference of agreement of who the information really belongs to. Does it belong to the person with the tissue? Does it report to you because you had the idea? These are important things. You don't think about it because you think everybody is going to be your best friend. And then, things happen in science, just like in personal relationships. If you're doing human data and if you're doing anything in humans or collecting human data or studying human data, you really need to look at the IRB, the Institutional Review Board. It may be interventions, interactions, or it could be health information access. And if it's a database, you need to have institutional, if it's a database from another institution, do you need a CRADA or an MTA to move that information over? And there are very specific policies that are beyond what I can do today. I would just say that it's in that research support system. I will tell you, I am not a fan of RSS. I know that's being recorded. I just, like today, it took me like hours to download things, and it's slow and they're having maintenance, but it is a system where you have many things available. So all of us doing animal work know where we put our forms in here. And every time I do something, I learn something new about RSS. Like my training, I didn't know there was like a training tab you could go to. The IRB is here. I would also encourage you, if you've never written an Institutional Review Board submission, that you get help in advance. Just reach out and say, hey, I'm thinking of doing this project. Is there someone I could speak to? Remember that some of the work you may be doing does not require IRB. For example, you may be like me, studying tissue from people that are brain dead donors, and there's authorization at the OPO, the Organ Procurement Organization, Levon, Nebraska, that you can lose those tissues. Those tissues and that research, the family has already authorized, should have already authorized, but you have to get an exemption letter. You have to submit and let the IRB know, I'm taking these people. And they'll say, but they're really not people, they're brain dead donors. And based on our language, they don't count as humans. I know it sounds weird. You have to get those exemption letters. They become important with your grant submissions. And they're important also in the follow-up and the ethics of what you're doing. And again, if you've never really done any of this, it's, you go to your mentor, there may be someone in your division or your laboratory, and certainly the coordinators for these committees are very, very helpful. And indeed, there's some simple questions when you're putting in an IRB submission that actually ask you, is this a biorepository? Is this samples? Do you need PHI, patient health information? Yes, no. I mean, I just recently did something in remnant tissue of living people, and I got an exemption because I went through the process and they said, you're not getting any PHI. These are mask samples. There's no identifiers. All there are, I just needed diagnosis X and I wanted to test my method. So I got an exemption to do that project, but I couldn't get funded without that exemption. And this is just a screenshot, so you all know where you have to go. And again, remember the tabs up at the top are the ones where you get everything in. They also have some helpful links in here that sometimes I use and have no idea. I think this is an old screenshot that doesn't even exist anymore because I have many more protocols, but this was when I first got here. There are other potential research resources that are very specific to UNMC, like SECORDA for collaboration for research, design, and analysis. Even if you're doing bench research, this really is critically important that, you know, how you came up with your research design for animal use now. There's tremendous focus on those numbers. It's not good enough anymore to just say, to get this specific size and what the effect is, you really need to have them. And I would involve your statistical analysis and information ahead of time as you're developing your project, so you know the scope of the project. You might need some clinical data, and Purnima Gouda has been really helpful here. If you're planning to go somebody approaches you to do a clinical trial in, for example, oxalosis, where I get reached out all the time because I have some interest in some genetic diseases and transition of healthcare in young adults. I go right to her or I have my coordinator and I say, hey, how many patients, new diagnoses of oxalosis existed in the adult patient population? And is it enough that it's worth doing the study? If it's going to be 1 or 2 a year, it may be a heavy lift to put personal resources towards a disease entity where you don't have enough of those patients, or maybe you want to study those patients, there just aren't enough. And that may require that you can get some pilot data, but you'll need to collaborate. There are some database tools that I can mention. And then also the CRC or CTR has some recruitment specialists that may be able to help you. So again, the other things you have to think about if you're doing human work is the investigational pharmacy, which we have here. That's quite good. They've also been a little bit helpful in guidance towards FDA, because if you're doing something super novel, you may need to get FDA approval to do so using what's called an IND. We have really, we have investigational pathology. I'm pushing them very, very hard for a bunch of studies that I'm doing, but they can do everything from cutting sections of tissue to providing you scan slides of certain pathologies that are de-identified. We have the biobank here, which is an outstanding resource. We have a research nursing corps available. And then of course there's insurance, which this is for clinical investigators. This sometimes is a painful predetermination, but very, very important in terms of if you're doing, early phase research, even phase 3 research, where there may be a research injury, you want to know what's going to be covered. So I think, critical to this in a different talk is really finding the mentor that will help you. And, sometimes in small environments, they're not even in your department. And that is not a problem as long as you have a subject matter person identified. So if your subject matter is specifically cardiovascular disease and an oncologist may be the person helping you technically with the technique, that you may need a mentorship team. And again, starting small and biting off small chunks is better than just having like the crazy life that I do. And again, you have to be passionate. So if you're picking an idea and you are not revved up about it, it's really going to come out to you to be the person that's going to keep the engine chugging along. If you're not passionate about it, if it's draining you, or you think, I don't know why I'm doing this, it just doesn't excite me, it's probably not something, even if it's an unmet need, if you're not jazzed about it, then step away and find something else. I'd like to say hire great people in the real world, but I'm now into hiring people and making them great. So I think that we can think about that. We're in a small environment in Omaha. We don't have big tech here. It's not like we live in New York or Philly or Chicago. It's hard to find really, really good people. And so you might find people that you have to develop and help them with the skills to help you. And again, you're responsible, okay, from all the aspects. You're responsible for the research integrity of your lab technician. You're responsible for having the right skills and training. If you're going to do clinical interventional studies, you need to have the right credentials. And if you're not sure, what I do is I have junior faculty where I'm the co-investigator. I don't get the big hurrahs. I'm not going to be on the papers, but I help them learn the ropes. And maybe that is something that you can consider as having that sort of relationship. So with that, I'm going to stop my share and end and see if there are any questions. And I don't know if I should be the one looking in the Q&A, but yes, I can. Okay.
Whatever's easiest for you.
If not, we'll be done early. No. I'll give you guys a few more minutes to be disinhibited, to put something in. Or go back to your lunch and enjoy. Can I elaborate about renting a nurse? So I actually just met this morning with Serena at the CRC to identify getting a nurse. So when you have to reach out to the CCTR and make an appointment to meet the nursing manager, and the kinds of things that they're going to want to know is, what's the study about? They're going to want to review the documents of the study. For example, the protocol, if there's a lab manual, a schedule of events, and what you exactly need a research nurse to help you with. So it's important to know in your own head, hey, what am I going to be doing? And how am I going to be executing the study? So I have things that are very simple, where I just need a coordinator. I don't even necessarily need an RN nurse. I have other studies where we have to have these EKGs done, and the nurse has to read them and put some certain intervals in a reporting system. Or maybe you just need blood drawn. And so that may be something else. So what I do is you need to have your protocol of what you're thinking of doing, and then you can reach out. They're going to want to know about funding and who's paying for it and all that. It may be a pilot study, and you need to just say, hey, I have a pilot study. I don't know if that helps explain it, Dr. Zhang, at all or not. What strategies do you recommend for preparing time for writing? So very good question. So I am way behind in my writing, and sometimes I do it on the weekend. My children are a little bit older now, so I have quiet time. I find that the less distraction I have, I can write. So if you're someone like me that the phone is going off and your email's bothering you, I make intentions now to put specific time in my calendar to write. So nobody schedules appointments for me. And I take opportunities. I also ask that if I'm writing collaboratively, that we set up a specific calendar. For example, if someone today sent me a paper, it's data that I generated years ago. An old mentee of mine wrote it all up, no idea that it was happening. And he said, I have to have this back by X date. Giving me a deadline, I work very, very well with deadlines. And so I think that's important. If you're thinking about applying for a grant and it's your first grant, you have got to have publications. You have to show your productivity. It may not be in that specific area, but if you're proposing something in a specific disease area, if you have any papers that show your technical capability within that area, you need to get them done and have them in your biosketch. It's hard when you open a biosketch and someone's proposing that they're going to cure cancer, and they've never done any kind of research. And it's very, very hard to say, well, why are they even eligible? Have they even done a collaborative study in cancer? Do they even see cancer patients? I mean, so I find that, a grant deadline is one that makes me urgent in terms of getting papers done. And then, setting a timeline myself, and then setting aside my own calendar time away and shutting everything off, because it's very easy to develop ADHD here with all the inputs you have. Who are the best people to contact for community-based research? That's a great question. So we actually do have a community-based research group. And actually, I'm blanking her name, Kiona King, I believe, is who does that. And I want to say she can do it through the IDeA CTR. Right, Chi-Chi?
Yes, she's the community engagement director.
And again, what specifically are you trying to do? Are you trying to collect samples? Are you trying to interview? Are you trying to do focus groups? Or are you just trying to expand a project you have here to get more diversity in terms of the community patients that you might see? Yeah, I think the writing group would be helpful. So there actually is a VCR service where you can pay for a professional editor. I don't know how good they are. I do think it's really important. I'm a deputy editor for a journal, and it often is very, very hard for me to, sometimes I feel bad because you sort of think you know what they're saying and you can't. And the days that the manuscript would be rewritten for you by the proofreader doesn't happen anymore. The proofreaders now just sort of copy and paste in your manuscript, and they'll mainly focus on journal style. They'll literally miss like spelling mistakes and like, run-on sentences and things that probably would be better corrected in Word. But again, just being kind of, understanding that, I think if English is not your first language, it's important to have someone do that service, whether it's for free or you have a colleague whose English is better, to make sure that the science may be really significant. But if you're not able to communicate that to the reviewers or to the editor, it's really a limitation. And again, not being uncomfortable, for example, at talks, presenting, many international meetings are in English because that's a common language, and being comfortable that you can present your ideas. So, I print out my talks ahead of time and I rehearse the heck out of my talks. I don't just show up and, and I'm crazy. A lot of times in the plane, I have time to think. I'm not getting a lot of input. I'm not paying for Wi-Fi, and I can sit and go over and say, what do I want to say on this slide? And I either write it out and put notes in, which is okay to bring to a podium, or from some of my colleagues, they put the phonetic reading of what they want to say and they read it at the podium, which I've seen happen. And I don't think, I'm like, now that's great because now I understand what they're trying to say. All right, it's almost the top of the hour. So if we're done, well, there's another question. Let me see. Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, so Heather, I'm happy to share my slides. We actually recorded this talk, and I know the previous vice chancellor asked if we could have access, and I'm happy to share those slides with the links embedded so that you could actually go to them if you're here at UNMC. They actually work. You're welcome. I hope it helps. I need a mentor. Yeah, I will make sure that we all need mentors. I need a mentor all the time too, and I'm not being facetious. Sometimes you just have to even as you get higher up, you have to have someone to listen and make sure, like, does this make sense? But I'll make sure to get a copy of those slides to Heather and to share with you along with this talk. Great. Well, thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it, and I really enjoy working with some of you quite a bit. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Dr.
very
Mannon.
much. Thank you, Dr. Mannon.
Have a good day.
You too.